In the vaults of history, where dust thickens on forgotten files and silence guards the sins of nations, there exist records so damning, so corrosive to the myths of wartime glory, that entire governments committed themselves to their erasure. These were not mere battlefield losses or political miscalculations. They were orchestrated operations, buried massacres, and betrayals dressed in the uniform of necessity. For decades, these files remained sealed behind the iron doors of ministries and intelligence agencies, stamped with the insignia of secrecy. Vertraulich, top secret, do not circulate. To stumble across them was to glimpse a war stripped of its official narratives, where allies conspired with enemies, where civilians were expendable, and where technological triumphs were built upon the bones of the enslaved. As one opens these suppressed archives, the tone is unmistakable, cold, methodical, and mercilessly precise, written not for the public, but for the architects of power themselves. Margins carry notes in the hands of men whose signatures determined life and death, stains of ink, burns from hurried destruction, and gaps in pagination hint at the desperate attempts to bury the truth forever. Each file is a black mirror reflecting the machinery of war, showing not only what was done, but also what was hidden, rewritten, and denied. Tonight, these shadows resurface. The vanished prisoners executed beneath the forests of Smolensk, the clandestine pact that nearly fractured the Allied front, the ghost convoys sacrificed upon the Baltic, and the underground factories where progress was paid for in blood. These are the dark files of the Second World War, the secrets governments tried to destroy. Chapter 1. The Vanished Prisoners of Katyn Forest. In the spring of 1940, within the heavily guarded chambers of the Soviet NKVD headquarters, orders were signed under the cold approval of Lavrenti Beria, head of Stalin's secret police. The directive carried the weight of finality, to liquidate more than 20,000 Polish prisoners of war, men who had survived the September campaign only to fall into Soviet hands. Their profiles filled thick dossiers: officers, professors, priests, doctors, lawyers, judges, leaders of a nation carved apart by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Each file bore photographs, fingerprints, and interrogation transcripts. What they shared in common was not guilt of crime, but status, education, and the potential to rebuild Poland once occupation ended. To the Soviet High Command, they were a danger to be removed, not individuals to be released. Prison camps in Kozelsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov became waypoints of death. Prisoners were called in small groups, told they were being relocated, and led to waiting trucks. The transports moved them under cover of darkness to secluded sites near Smolensk, most infamously the Katyn forest. There, beneath the whispering trees, execution squads armed with German Walther pistols carried out methodical killings, one by one, with a bullet to the back of the head. The choice of weapon was no accident. It was an intentional layer of deception, intended to suggest German responsibility should the bodies ever be discovered. For weeks, trucks rumbled along forest roads, their engines muffling the shots that silenced Poland's elite. The burial grounds were marked not with stones or memorials, but with crude earthworks. Long trenches were dug in advance, some stretching dozens of meters, where the lifeless were stacked in layers, their hands bound with wire. The soil was turned quickly as new prisoners arrived for execution. Soviet officers kept meticulous records, names crossed from lists, camp populations updated daily, before forwarding summary reports to Moscow. Yet within the reports lies the chilling efficiency of bureaucracy applied to mass death. Lives were reduced to numbers, initials, and lines of ink signed by men far removed from the sound of gunfire. 3 years later, in April 1943, the German Wehrmacht advancing on Smolensk unearthed the first graves. Their discovery was seized as a propaganda tool, announced to the world through press tours and photographs of skulls, uniforms, and rosaries. Berlin proclaimed the massacre as evidence of Soviet barbarity, attempting to fracture the fragile alliance with Britain and the United States. The Nazis invited international observers, including doctors from occupied Europe, to confirm the estimated date of death as 1940, long before the German invasion of the Soviet Union. In response, Moscow denied responsibility and declared the Germans had orchestrated the massacre themselves in 1941. Soviet reports accused the Wehrmacht of manufacturing evidence, planting documents, and fabricating the crime to conceal their own atrocities. Caught in the middle, the Polish government in exile in London demanded answers. They pressed for an independent Red Cross investigation, but such requests were dismissed under Allied pressure. Winston Churchill, though privately convinced of Soviet guilt, silenced discussion to protect the alliance against Hitler. Franklin Roosevelt received intelligence briefings indicating Soviet responsibility, but chose to suppress them. Declassified British Foreign Office files decades later revealed deliberate strategies to downplay Katyn, avoiding confrontation with Stalin at a time when the Eastern Front bore the weight of German defeat. The massacre was thus buried not only in soil, but in the archives of Allied diplomacy. The silence extended long after the war. At the Nuremberg trials, Soviet prosecutors attempted to attribute Katyn to the Germans, entering forged documents and coerced testimonies. Western judges, unwilling to provoke Stalin, allowed the claims to pass unchallenged, though the charges were eventually dropped for lack of conclusive evidence. In Poland, now under Soviet influence, discussion of Katyn was forbidden. Families of the missing officers were denied official recognition, their grief silenced by censorship and fear of arrest. Generations grew up with whispered truths, photographs hidden in drawers, and empty seats at family tables. It was only in the 1970s and 1980s, as cracks formed in the Soviet regime, that exiled Polish organizations began pushing the issue into the public consciousness. Underground journals, smuggled testimonies, and samizdat publications kept the memory alive. When Mikhail Gorbachev's policy of glasnost took hold, pressure mounted. Finally, in 1990, the Soviet Union officially admitted responsibility, releasing fragments of secret files. Among them was Beria's signed order, a document once kept in Stalin's personal archive, confirming the decision for the supreme punishment. Yet even then, not all records were released. Key files remain classified, missing or destroyed, leaving historians to piece together fragments of truth from scattered archives across Russia, Poland, and Germany. What makes Katyn so haunting is not only the massacre itself, but the layers of deception that followed. The false reports, the propaganda campaigns, the suppression by allies, and the decades of silence form a second crime, a murder of memory. The graves in the forest became a symbol of a nation stripped of its leaders, a wound reopened each time evidence was denied. Forensic reports detail rosaries still clutched in skeletal hands, diaries that end mid-sentence, and documents stamped with Polish insignias, preserved in the soil like frozen cries for recognition. Each artifact testifies not just to death, but to deliberate erasure. Survivors of the camps who escaped the massacre spoke of a growing dread as comrades vanished in groups, never to return. Letters home ceased abruptly in April 1940. Families waited in silence, writing to Soviet authorities, only to receive vague replies claiming relocation to unknown destinations. For decades, they carried unanswered questions, suspecting the truth yet forbidden to speak it. The forest of Katyn, with its tall pines and stillness, became a place where history itself was buried under layers of denial. The Katyn files remind us that war is fought not only with weapons, but with documents, silence, and deception. Governments knew yet chose concealment. Leaders signed their names yet erased their accountability. The truth emerged slowly, in fragments, from archives once sealed with iron locks. To read them today is to hear the echo of gunfire beneath the pines, and the whispered promise that such crimes cannot remain hidden forever. Chapter 2: The Forbidden Pact of Operation Juliett. In the shifting balance of 1941, as German forces pushed eastward toward Moscow and the Soviet Union teetered on the brink of collapse, a set of files hidden deep within British archives tell of a covert contact so dangerous, so corrosive to Allied unity that it was officially denied for decades. Stamped Restricted Access J17 and circulated only among the highest levels of MI6, these papers reveal a clandestine initiative known as Operation Juliett. Unlike celebrated wartime strategies, this was never meant to see daylight. It was the record of back-channel conversations between representatives of the British establishment and selected elements of the Wehrmacht, conversations that entertained the unthinkable, a negotiated ceasefire in the West if Germany concentrated its fury against the Soviet Union. The political backdrop was one of desperation and fear. By the summer of 1941, Adolf Hitler's Operation Barbarossa had unleashed millions of troops into Soviet territory, annihilating defenses and advancing hundreds of kilometers within weeks. Soviet cities such as Kiev and Smolensk were falling. and the Red Army was staggering under immense losses. In London, Winston Churchill stood firm in his pledge to support Moscow, declaring that Britain would aid Russia regardless of ideology. Yet within the corridors of Whitehall and the shadowy rooms of MI6, doubts persisted. Could the Soviet Union survive? And if it fell, would Britain stand alone once more, facing a Germany strengthened by conquered resources from the east? Into this climate of uncertainty entered Operation Juliett. The files describe coded cables routed through neutral embassies, messages carried by intermediaries under false passports, and meetings arranged in Stockholm and Madrid. Emissaries identified only by code names. Silver, representing the British Channel. Falcon, a German liaison allegedly tied to high-ranking Wehrmacht officers, convened under strict secrecy. Their discussions centered on conditional terms. Germany would halt its bombing campaign against Britain and promise non-interference in Western Europe, while Britain would refrain from direct involvement in the Eastern campaign, allowing the Wehrmacht to dedicate its full force against the Soviet Union. In return, guarantees were hinted at: security of sea lanes, economic concessions, and the possibility of limited prisoner exchanges. It was not an official negotiation. The cabinet was never formally consulted, and Churchill's approval remains absent from the surviving papers. Instead, the initiative appears to have been advanced by a faction within British intelligence and political circles who feared the consequences of aligning too closely with Moscow. The fear of communism remained potent, even in the face of Nazism. In their calculations, a Europe dominated by a weakened but intact Germany was less threatening than a Soviet Union emboldened by victory. Such thinking, preserved in memoranda labeled "For Restricted Eyes Only," reflects the moral compromises whispered about, but rarely admitted during total war. The files indicate that German representatives provided intelligence to strengthen trust. Reports on Soviet troop movements, supply shortages, and internal unrest were shared in encrypted documents, some corroborated by subsequent Soviet records. In exchange, British channels hinted at naval positioning, carefully omitting critical details, but offering just enough to prove sincerity. One document, later recovered from a burned file marked J175, references a conversation where German officers requested assurance that Britain would not deploy additional forces to the Middle East should a ceasefire occur. The response, ambiguous but suggestive, was enough to sustain further contact. When fragments of these communications reached Moscow, the effect was immediate. Soviet counterintelligence, the NKVD, intercepted hints of the back channel through agents embedded in Sweden. Reports delivered to Stalin painted a grim picture. His Western allies, already reluctant, might be conspiring to leave the Soviet Union to face Germany alone. Whether Stalin believed every detail remains debated, but his distrust hardened. It was during this period that Stalin repeatedly accused Churchill of withholding the opening of a second front, suspecting deliberate delay. The Juliett files, though never publicly acknowledged, provide a chilling foundation for that paranoia. The meetings themselves appear to have dissolved by late 1941 as the German advance stalled before Moscow's winter defences and as Churchill solidified his position on unconditional resistance to Hitler. By 1942, the United States had entered the war, binding the Allies closer together. Operation Juliett was quietly shelved, its documents hidden in secure vaults, many marked for destruction. Yet not all were eliminated. Surviving fragments, pieced together in later decades through declassified papers, reveal how close Britain came to exploring terms with its sworn enemy, and how fragile the unity of the Allies truly was. The consequences of this buried operation stretched beyond its brief existence. Soviet mistrust of Western intentions deepened into a permanent scar. During post-war negotiations at Yalta and Potsdam, Stalin's suspicion colored every discussion, driving him to demand territorial guarantees and buffer zones. To him, betrayal was not a possibility, but an expectation, justified by the whispers he had received in 1941. British records show that even within Parliament, rumours of secret dealings circulated, though they were dismissed publicly as Nazi fabrications. In truth, fragments of truth had been woven into the fabric of propaganda. Eyewitness testimony to these contacts is scarce, yet there are tantalizing traces. An MI6 courier later testified, under restricted session in 1958, that he had carried sealed pouches marked "For Juliett" across Stockholm under diplomatic cover. A Swedish police report from 1941 records the detention of a man carrying forged papers matching the alias of Falcon, though he was released before questioning under pressure from foreign diplomats. Spanish intelligence archives, still partially sealed, reference unusual Anglo-German conversations taking place in Madrid hotels during the same months. These scattered hints converge to paint a picture of an operation that walked the edge of treason while cloaked in patriotic justification. The deliberate destruction of documents adds to the aura of suppressed history. Several Juliett files were burned in Whitehall furnaces during the 1950s under Operation Blue Ink, a clearance program aimed at purging records that could embarrass the state. Surviving memoranda mention entire sections missing, gaps where conversations surely occurred but no written trace remains. For historians, these voids are as telling as the documents that survived. They testify to the fear of revelation, the lengths to which governments will go to sanitize their wartime record. The moral weight of Operation Juliett lies not only in its existence, but in its implications. It suggests that beneath the rhetoric of unity, the Allies were prepared to consider betrayal when the balance of power appeared uncertain. It highlights the brutal calculus of war, where ideological enemies might become tools and survival outweighed loyalty. And it demonstrates how secrecy itself becomes a weapon, not only against external foes but against one's own citizens, who were never meant to know the fragile foundations of the alliances fought in their name. Today, when these fragments are read aloud in the cold monotone of classified reports, the language still chills. Conditional cessation of hostilities, neutrality in Eastern operations, reassurances on Western non-interference. Each phrase carries the weight of what might have been a divided alliance, a stronger Reich, a prolonged war. That it did not happen does not erase the fact that it was considered, planned, and nearly executed. Operation Juliett remains a forbidden chapter of history, erased from public record but preserved in the shadows of intelligence files. A reminder that even in the so-called good war, lines of loyalty were dangerously blurred. Chapter 3. Ghost Convoys of Operation Hannibal. In January 1945, as the Red Army surged into East Prussia and the Third Reich crumbled from within, the German High Command launched one of the most desperate and least acknowledged operations of the entire war. Known as Operation Hannibal, it was a massive evacuation by sea, rivaling and even surpassing the scale of Dunkirk, yet deliberately buried in both Allied and German post-war narratives. Files once stored in Kriegsmarine archives under designation 21B reveal not only the staggering scale of the exodus, but also the darker truths of who was chosen to survive, and who was condemned to drown in the freezing waters of the Baltic Sea. The official order came on January 23, 1945, issued by Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz from his headquarters in Plön. With Soviet forces cutting off retreat by land, East Prussian civilians, wounded soldiers, and military personnel were to be evacuated by any available vessel. Passenger liners, freighters, fishing boats, and naval ships were pressed into service, forming convoys that streamed out of ports such as Gotenhafen, Pillau, and Königsberg. Estimates suggest more than 2 million people were moved over the following months, but the true figure remains obscured by chaos, missing logs, and deliberate suppression. Dönitz himself described the effort as a humanitarian rescue, yet Kriegsmarine File 21B paints a harsher picture. It was also an organized escape route for high-ranking Nazi officials, SS units, and valuable scientists, all quietly prioritized above ordinary civilians. Among the vessels most infamous in these convoys was the Wilhelm Gustloff, a former cruise ship converted into a transport, which departed Gotenhafen on January 30, 1945, carrying more than 10,000 souls, soldiers, nurses, women, and children, despite being designed for fewer than 2,000. That night, in icy darkness, it was struck by 3 torpedoes fired by Soviet submarine S-13 under Captain Alexander Marinesko. The ship sank within an hour. Over 9,000 perished, making it the deadliest maritime disaster in recorded history. Survivors described the horror of lifeboats frozen to decks, people trampled in panic, and children slipping beneath black waves lit only by burning fuel. Yet for decades, this catastrophe was absent from official accounts, overshadowed by Nuremberg and silenced by post-war politics. The Gustloff was not the only casualty. Days later, the General von Steuben, overloaded with wounded soldiers and refugees, was torpedoed by the same submarine, killing thousands more. The Goya, another converted vessel, met a similar fate in April. taking nearly 7,000 with her. Convoy after convoy became floating targets, moving slowly through mine-laden waters, hunted by Soviet submarines determined to exact vengeance for years of German atrocities. Kriegsmarine File 21B records these losses in chilling brevity: ship name, date, tonnage, estimated casualties, before moving on to the next entry, reducing thousands of lives to a ledger line. What is most damning in the surviving files are the patterns of priority. Reports reveal that passenger manifests were manipulated, with entire compartments sealed off for SS officers, party officials, and their families. Scientists tied to secret weapons programs were quietly smuggled westward under false designations, their presence omitted from official tallies. Civilians were herded onto exposed decks or confined to lower holds, often locked behind hatches to prevent panic. Survivor testimonies, collected decades later in interviews, describe children left screaming as guards ensured that special passengers reached lifeboats first. For the Kriegsmarine, the preservation of elite personnel outweighed the survival of the masses they claimed to rescue. The Allies, too, bore responsibility for the silence that followed. When the war ended, both Western powers and the Soviets avoided drawing attention to Hannibal. For the Allies, highlighting the suffering of German civilians conflicted with narratives of Nazi guilt and Allied justice. For the Soviets, acknowledging the full toll risked exposing their submariners to accusations of indiscriminate slaughter. As a result, the largest evacuation in naval history disappeared from public discourse, its documents locked away or destroyed. Survivors often found themselves disbelieved, their trauma unwelcome in societies eager to forget. Conditions aboard the Hannibal convoys were appalling. Reports described decks crusted with ice, engines failing under the strain of overcrowding, and seas churned with debris and corpses. Winter storms lashed the Baltic, extinguishing lights and freezing the exposed. Ammunition and fuel were stored alongside civilians, turning ships into floating powder kegs. Medical staff worked without supplies, amputating frostbitten limbs with makeshift tools, while priests gave last rites in corners of cargo holds. The sheer scale of human misery defies comprehension, yet the surviving documents read with cold detachment, as though recording the movement of equipment rather than people. One haunting detail emerges repeatedly in testimonies: the silence of the sea after disaster. Survivors floating on wreckage describe hours in darkness, listening to the cries of thousands gradually fade until only the wind remained. The Baltic itself became a grave, its waters holding entire generations erased in nights of terror. To this day, divers occasionally recover relics, children's shoes, rusted weapons, identification tags, reminders of the convoys erased from official memory. The destruction of documentation after 1945 was systematic. Kriegsmarine officers burned logs before capture, ensuring that details of evacuation priorities would not be exposed during Allied interrogations. What survived were fragments, scattered among naval intelligence reports, Soviet archives, and testimonies gathered unofficially by survivors. These fragments, when assembled, reveal the full scope. Operation Hannibal was both a humanitarian evacuation and a calculated betrayal, where lives were weighed against status, and expendable masses were sacrificed so that the Reich's chosen few might escape. Even decades later, the ghosts of Hannibal linger. In East Prussian villages, families still speak of relatives who vanished without trace. Survivors recall the smell of burning oil, the sound of steel tearing apart, the icy shock of the Baltic. Historians piecing together the truth confront not only missing documents, but also deliberate disinformation campaigns that downplayed losses or recast them as tragic accidents of war. The reality was harsher. Thousands were condemned by the very regime that claimed to protect them, their suffering erased to shield those who profited from their deaths. The tragedy of Operation Hannibal is not only in the staggering number of lives lost, but in the deliberate concealment that followed. Unlike Dunkirk, immortalized as a tale of survival, Hannibal was written out of history. Where Dunkirk celebrated ordinary soldiers saved, Hannibal betrayed ordinary civilians drowned. To read the scattered files today is to confront a crime of omission, a vast human disaster hidden beneath layers of denial, a silence as deep and cold as the waters that swallowed the convoys whole. Chapter 4: The Secret Weapons of Camp Dora. Beneath the shadowed ridges of the Harz Mountains in central Germany, hidden within a labyrinth of tunnels carved into rock, The Reich pursued one of its most secretive and brutal wartime projects, known as Mittelwerk, and supplied with human labor from the adjacent Dora Mittelbau concentration camp. This facility became the birthplace of the V2 rocket, a weapon designed to rain destruction upon London and Antwerp. Yet behind the technological breakthrough lay a story of unparalleled cruelty and suppression, recorded in SS files marked Sonderakte Dora and later fragmented across Allied interrogation reports. These files reveal not only the conditions of the underground factory, but also the disturbing bargains made by victorious nations, who concealed atrocities to secure the scientific spoils of war. Construction of the underground complex began in 1943, after Allied bombing rendered the Peenemünde testing site vulnerable. Under orders from the SS and the Ministry of Armaments, led by Albert Speer, forced laborers were brought from Buchenwald and other camps to excavate miles of tunnels. Conditions were apocalyptic. Prisoners worked 12 to 16 hours a day in choking dust, with no daylight, inadequate ventilation, and constant risk of cave-ins. Food rations barely sustained life, and disease spread rapidly. Testimonies estimate that of the 60,000 men imprisoned in Dora Mittelbau, more than 20,000 perished. Many from exhaustion, starvation, or execution. Corpses were often stacked in tunnels, their bodies removed only when stench threatened the workforce still alive. The SS maintained strict terror within the camp. Prisoners suspected of sabotage, loosening bolts, misaligning circuits, or damaging wiring were executed by hanging inside the tunnels, their deaths staged as warnings to others. Sonderakte Dora includes chilling records of public examples, carried out before entire work details. Guards carried out beatings with steel rods, and medical experiments were rumored, though documentation remains incomplete. Survivors recall faint light bulbs swinging above gallows erected between rocket fuselages. The spectacle of death set against machinery meant to pierce the skies. Yet amid this darkness, the V2 itself took form. At 30 feet tall, carrying nearly a ton of explosive, it represented a technological leap as the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. The program was championed by engineers including Wernher von Braun, whose later fame in the American space program obscures the role he played in Dora. Interrogation transcripts from 1945, preserved in US military archives, record von Braun visiting the tunnels, observing conditions, and at minimum being aware of the human cost. Whether he participated directly in abuse remains debated, but the files reveal that scientists prioritized production quotas over human survival, demanding increased labor regardless of fatalities. As the war drew to a close, Dora's importance shifted. By late 1944, the V2 bombardment of London had begun, sowing terror across the British capital. Hundreds were killed, thousands wounded, as rockets struck without warning. But beyond terror, the weapon carried strategic value. It proved that Germany could develop technologies years ahead of its enemies. This fact made the facility a prime target for both the Americans and Soviets, who raced toward the Harz Mountains in the war's final months. In April 1945, US forces overran the complex, seizing documents, rockets, and personnel. What they found shocked even battle-hardened soldiers. Skeletal survivors, tunnels littered with corpses, and the machinery of modern warfare built on human suffering. The aftermath reveals one of the most unsettling aspects of Camp Dora. Rather than expose the full extent of atrocities, the US and its allies quickly moved to secure the scientific gains. Operation Paperclip, authorized in 1945, transferred dozens of German scientists, including von Braun, to the United States, where their expertise fed into ballistic missile programs and the nascent space race. Reports of Dora's conditions were downplayed, while testimonies of survivors were buried in classified appendices. In the Soviet zone, parallel actions occurred. Engineers and machinery were shipped eastward, their labor redirected towards Soviet rocketry. In both cases, truth was sacrificed to technological advantage. Survivors who attempted to testify faced indifference or suppression. At post-war trials, only a handful of Dora's administrators faced justice. SS General Hans Kammler, who oversaw secret weapons projects, vanished in 1945, his fate shrouded in mystery. Some claimed he died by suicide, others that he was captured and recruited by Western intelligence. Mittelwerk managers faced prosecution, yet sentences were often lenient, overshadowed by the Cold War's urgency. The story of Dora thus became fragmented, a horror acknowledged in passing, but never fully confronted by those who profited from its legacy. The tunnels themselves, once a monument to suffering, were partially destroyed after the war, sealed to prevent reuse. Yet even in ruins they remain haunted. Visitors describe an oppressive silence, broken only by dripping water, as though the rock itself remembers the cries of the enslaved. Rusted machinery lies abandoned, its steel corroded but still recognizable as the framework of rockets. The walls bear scratches where prisoners carved initials or prayers, fragile traces of individuality against the machinery of annihilation. These markings, more than official documents, testify to the humanity consumed in the pursuit of weaponry. The suppressed files of Camp Dora force us to confront not only Nazi brutality, but Allied complicity. Documents labeled "not for release" include photographs of emaciated prisoners, reports of executions, and testimonies describing starvation diets and disease. Yet these were classified for decades, hidden to protect the reputations of men celebrated as pioneers in space exploration. Even today, some archives remain closed, citing national security. The irony is stark. Truths buried to shield nations from embarrassment, even as those truths were born of suffering inflicted underground in total secrecy. Camp Dora represents the convergence of human ingenuity and human cruelty. The rockets that rose from its tunnels were precursors to technologies that would later carry mankind to the moon. Yet they were assembled by hands trembling from hunger, bound by chains, and silenced by fear. Every launch carried with it not only explosive payloads, but also the weight of thousands of unmarked graves. To read Sonderakte Dora, with its clinical enumeration of quotas, is to glimpse a world where progress was purchased at the highest possible cost. In the end, Dora is not only a site of history, but a mirror. It reflects the willingness of nations to bury uncomfortable truths when convenient, to prioritize power over justice, and to exploit knowledge born of atrocity. The tunnels may be sealed, but the files, those fragments that survived fire and classification, continue to whisper. They speak of men hanged between rocket shells, of scientists walking past corpses to inspect machines, of survivors whose voices were drowned out by the roar of rockets hailed as triumphs of modernity. And they remind us that beneath every advance, there may lie a hidden chamber where progress is written not in ink, but in blood. In the shadows of Europe's wartime archives, silence lingers louder than truth. The files we have unearthed, Katyn, Juliett, Hannibal, Dora, are not isolated tragedies, but interwoven strands of a darker fabric, stitched together by secrecy, denial, and the cold arithmetic of power. In each case, governments chose concealment over confession, narrative over reality, survival over justice. The vanished prisoners of Katyn remind us how easily ink can erase lives. The forbidden channels of Operation Juliett expose the fragility of alliances built on mistrust. The drowned convoys of Hannibal testify to a human disaster as vast as any battlefield defeat. And the tunnels of Camp Dora reveal that even the stars we one day reached were shadowed by the graves of the enslaved. Yet still, questions remain. What other files lie sealed in basements beneath Moscow, Berlin, London, or Washington? What names were struck from records? What testimonies shredded before they could be heard? And perhaps most chilling, how much of the war's legacy has been deliberately rewritten, not only to protect the guilty, but to serve the ambitions of the victorious? The smoke of those furnaces that consumed incriminating papers may have long since faded, but the truths they carried still haunt the margins of history. As long as silence persists, the past remains unfinished, demanding voices to speak where the dead cannot. For every file destroyed, another waits to be found. For every secret buried, another clawing to the surface. These were not just dark files of the Second World War. They were warnings. Warnings we are still too reluctant to heed.